So, welcome, John, to our MEATigation final meeting, and thank you for your lecture.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Looks like a great array of papers over the next couple of days. I'm teaching quite a lot, but I'll dip in where I can. Let me share my screen. This will probably involve a certain amount of a net fumbling with the technology for a second.
No problem.
Here we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, I will launch into this. So I'm a literary historian, and I've been collecting stories about cultured meat probably for over a decade
Mm.
now, quite a bit over a decade, maybe more like 12 years. And I've got a bibliography of probably kind of 70 to 80 stories that represent in vitro meat or something very like it. And you might think that cultured meat dates back to Mark Post in 2013, or you might go further back and think it begins with Katz and Zer and their tissue culture and art work from the early part of the millennium, or you might even go further back and think about Winston Churchill's
Mm-hmm.
relatively off the cuff remark, more on that shortly, in the 1930s. But I'm tracing the idea of cultured meat back to the 1880s, where that's the earliest references to something that we would call cultured meat I've found so
Mm.
far. And if anybody's got any earlier examples or other examples, please do let me know. I'm always aware that I've got more to learn, and this bibliography is only ever partial. So the text that
John, maybe you
yeah,
can start like the slideshow. So
has it not come up yet?
I think we're seeing your draft. So if you press like on slideshow from the
Oh,
start, like,
okay, hang
because
on.
then
There we go.
perfect. Yeah, like from beginning or
Sorry.
like I think it's top left as I look at it at least.
Yeah, there we go.
Perfect.
Is that sorry? So that's but yes, good.
Yes.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
So most of the texts about cultured meat are in the world of science or speculative fiction, and that should come as no surprise, since the public discourse around cultured meat always necessarily refers to that. So one of the most prominent ideas in reporting about cultured meat is that science fiction made flesh. So here's a quotation from quite recently from Jennifer Mishler, referring to cultured meat and saying, what was once the stuff of science fiction is finally moving closer to our dinner plates. Or we've got Uma Valletti's comment that people said it was science fiction. This is real. And I can come up with all kinds of different examples of this in which the material developments in cellular agriculture are always necessarily coded as a fictional enterprise. There's one of the many lab meat startups has got the name Sci-Fi Foods to emphasize this point as well. But I'm interested in what kind of thing exactly this science fiction is. So all of these references to science fiction as a part of the debate around cultured meat tend to be incredibly generic. They don't tell us anything about what the substance is, what the world is that it enters into. So this is the nature of the project, to think through what is the deep history behind these relatively off-the-cuff references to science or speculative fiction as being integral to the stuff of cultured meat. One of the few literary references that you do get is from Winston Churchill. So I'm just struggling. Let me just memorize. Yeah. So Winston Churchill's always there. I don't know if you've come across him. I imagine you have if you've read around cultured meat. You often get a very brief reference to Churchill as a kind of endorsement of cultured meat. He adds a kind of patrician, patriarchal, aristocratic authority to the idea of it, but nobody ever really substantiates what he said. It was an essay called 50 Years Hence in 1932 that is often referred to, and here's a quotation you probably come across. We shall escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken in order to eat the breast or wing by growing these parts separately under a suitable medium. So if there's anything quoted at all about the prehistory of cultured meat, that's probably the quotation you're likely to see. But Churchill didn't come up with this. In fact, he nicked it. So he was an arch plagiarist. And so there are two immediate sources behind this. So the most immediate one is from his friend's work, Frederick Smith, who was the Earl of Birkenhead, who wrote a book in 1930, just before 50 Years Hence was published, called The World in 2030. So it's a non-fictional prophecy, I suppose you might say, of what would happen if you fast forwarded 100 years into the future from when he was writing. Smith writes, synthetic foods and the production of animal tissues in vitro will finally set at rest those timid minds which prophesy a day when the Earth's resources will not feed her children. But even before that, another 6 years, Smith stole it from JBS Haldane, who wrote another anticipation of the future world called Daedalus, or Science in the Future. And in this, Haldane anticipates that many of our foodstuffs, including the proteins, we shall probably build up from simpler sources such as coal and atmospheric nitrogen. Synthetic food will substitute the flower garden and the factory for the dunghill and the slaughterhouse, and make the city at last self-sufficient. So this chain of textual references here indicates one of the main strands in the early history of cultured meat, which is the idea of utopianism. And the book I'm writing about it is called Utopian Protein, because that is one of the main elements here. But we can go further back. And this is the sketch of the 7 texts I'll be talking about for the next half hour or so. I'm not going to go into any great detail about any one of them. I'll be skipping through them quite briskly, just to indicate some of the main strands in the representation of cultured meat. And I'll give a kind of a brief critical theory flavour of it towards the end, as well, as a way of wrapping up and seeing what we can draw from this surprisingly extensive literary history. So starting in 1881 with Bradley Lane's Missoura, Kurt Laswit's Two Planets, René Barjavel's Ashes, Ashes, Paul and Cornbluth's The Space Merchants, Arthur C. Clarke's Food of the Gods, Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake, probably the best known of these, and Matt Blackwell's Beef. So that is where we are going, and this is where we start. So this, as far as I have so far divined, is the first text that engages with something like cultured meat. And it is not a book that you are likely to have read or come across. It remains quite a minor text. Bradley Lane was a schoolmistress in Ohio. She wrote 2 books. The first was Missoura. The second one, called Escanaba, is completely lost. So it was recorded as being published, but no copies of it remain. So she's something of a mystery. Even though in literary historical terms she's a minor writer, there are some notable literary historical significances to this text. It is, for example, the first all-female utopia written in the United States. And this was a period, the 1880s and 1890s, when utopian fiction was abounding. As Warren Belasco writes, that expressed much of the period's faith in progress. A better world was coming. So Missoura narrates the journey of a Russian noblewoman, Vera Zarovich, who escapes from prison in Siberia and attempts a journey no other of my sex has ever attempted, escaping from her captors across the Arctic Ocean towards the North Pole, where rowing alone over the undulating waters, she's swept into a whirlpool, and she's swept down, down beneath the sea until she finds herself, with bewildered delight, transported to a land of enchantment. And this, of course, is Missoura, a secret world in which not a man nor the suggestion of one was to be seen, and in which a remarkable egalitarian feminist society flourishes. So most of that narrative is concerned with Vera's description of the world that she discovers. There's very little in the way of narrative progression. It's statically focused on various different aspects of technology and social justice that Vera comes across. Some of it is quite prescient. There's stuff about renewable energy, for example. But my focus is on how Mary Bradley Lane envisions the future of food, writing from the 1880s. So in Missoura, agriculture has finished. Here is one of the first observations that Vera makes as she discovers this strange new land. Agriculture was a lost art. No one I questioned had any knowledge of it. It had vanished in the dim past of barbarism. With the exception of vegetables and fruit, which were raised in luscious perfection, their food came from the elements. A famine among such enlightened people was impossible. Scarcity was unknown. Food for the body and food for the mind was without price. It was owing to this that poverty was unknown to them, as well as disease. The absolute purity of all they ate preserved an activity of vital power long exceeding our lifespan. So the key element for Lane here is the combination of technological mastery and social progress. The purity of the food creates a situation in which poverty and disease become unknown. All the women that Vera meets are stunningly beautiful and look much younger than they appear to be. And a lot of this is to do with the cultivation, the culturing of food. Here's what Vera says about this. The Mizorans took certain chemicals, converted them into milk and cream and cheese and butter and every variety of meat in a vessel that admitted neither air nor light. They claimed that their admission of air or light exercised a material influence on the chemical production of foods, which I think is true, isn't it? That they could not be made successfully by artificial processes when exposed to these two agents. Their earliest efforts had been unsuccessful at exact imitation, and a perfect result had only been obtained by closely counterfeiting the processes of nature. So often you might hear criticisms of cultured meat referring to it as an unnatural process, but for Lane, it's the perfection of nature rather than something that goes against nature. The cream prepared artificially that I tasted in London was the same colour and consistency of natural cream, but it lacked its relish. The cream manufactured in Mizora was a perfect imitation of the finest dairy product. It was the same with meats. They combined the elements and the article possessed no detrimental flavour. It was a more economical way of obtaining meat than by fattening animals. And that's one of 3 or 4 quite brief passages in the book that describe the process and the significance of something that is quite similar to cultured meat. What I think is really interesting about this text, and this is not uncommon in writing of the 1880s and not even uncommon in feminist writing of the 1880s, is the way in which technological advancement is closely related to eugenics. And this is part of the network of eliminations that informs the utopia of Mizora. So Vera begins to notice that everybody looks very similar. Everybody is white with blonde hair, and things become even clearer when she visits a portrait gallery which shows some illustrations of people from the long distant past of Mizora. And she has this conversation with one of her hosts, which indicates a quite starkly racist subtext to the novel. We believe that the highest excellence of moral and mental character is alone attainable by a fair race. The elements of evil belong to the dark race. Vera asks, and were the people of this country once of mixed complexions? As you see in the portraits, yes, was the reply. And what became of the dark complexions? We eliminated them. So there's a process of racial genocide, and the word elimination is something that runs throughout the text. So the coarser nature of men was eliminated from the present race. Mizorans have eliminated hereditary disease. They've eliminated from our food the deleterious earthly matter. And that's their constant aim. So all of these eliminations raise some interesting questions about the way in which cultured meat is related to politics here. So you will, I'm sure, have come across the term clean meat as one of the many titles that cultured meat is given. And you can see this emphasis on purity, eugenics, and what you might think of as proto-fascism give a particularly disturbing emphasis to the idea of clean meat here. Next, we move to the father of German science fiction, who's got a crater on Mars named after him. This is Kurt Laswitz, who writes this novel, Two Planets, in 1897. This is the second of the novels that I've come across so far that's got cultured meat in it. And this is the story of alien invasion. 2 explorers, Gunther and Saltner, are captured by Martians in the Arctic and taken back to Mars. There's a whole thing about the Arctic and cultured meat, which is an interesting subtext to this body of work. So we learn in the novel about a technologically advanced Martian society and about their plans to colonize Earth to harvest solar energy. And the result is a war between Earth and Mars. And Robert Markley writes that this explores the moral, political, and philosophical complexities and consequences of colonialism. And writing about space in the 1880s, 90s, and into the 20th century is often a way of talking about empire as well. And here we meet the automatic sausage. So this is when Gunther and Saltner are abducted and they're up in the Martian spaceship and they're fumbling about and they come across this strange machine for generating food. A trowel-shaped tray became visible, and from an opening above, objects fell into it, which were as thick as a finger and slightly brown like small sausages. That's breakfast and not a washstand, Saltner smilingly exclaimed, and sampled the sticks, which looked inviting and smelled spicy. They tasted excellent and proved to be a crunchy pastry filled with a hearty meat stuffing. And while he was eating his first stick, the machine continued its activity. Pastry after pastry fell on the tray. Too much of a blessing, Saltner thought, and tried to switch off this mysterious sort of food. An unending stream of meat rolls dropped into the tray, falling out of the table and floor. So it's interesting here, the cornucopian description of cultured meat in an era perennially concerned with food politics, food shortages, food technology. These sausages literally cannot be stopped. There's more food than they can possibly eat. And so that's part of the background here. As the novel continues, we realise that these sausages are part of a whole network of chemical studies that the Martians undertake. They synthesize chemicals found from rocks and proteins into the proteins and carbohydrates necessary to manufacture food. All they need for this process is sunlight, and that's why they need to colonize Earth to harvest solar energy. After the Martians take over planet Earth, humans initially benefit from the rule of the rich and highly civilized Martians. But animals do not benefit from this, and this is also a connection to Mizora. One of the things that Vera discovers is all the animals have been exterminated. Under Martian rule, we learn that keeping of domestic animals in human residences is not allowed and will be punished severely. All the dogs are killed, I'm sorry to say. And on meeting a horse, a Martian woman is horrified. It's horrible, this ugly wild animal, barbaric, how it smells. So the prioritizing of cultured meat is at the expense of animals. Animals are completely vanquished from this world. But the humans fight back. There's a rebellion against the Martians, which focuses on food. The grown stuff, i.e. the stuff that comes from an animal, is considered, one revolutionary writes, to be more patriotic. So it's a sense in which German traditional food cultures, German meat cultures, are the center point of the revolutionary energy against the Martians with their cultured meat. Moving to René Bahavel, Ashes, Ashes, which is a post-apocalyptic, it's an apocalyptic novel from 1943. Again, science fiction. One of the things that I really like about this project is the material culture of sci-fi pulp publishing. And you can see here this rather dramatic cover and the even more dramatic writing on the back that describes what this novel is about. Bloated bodies, bat attacks, fire, famine. Dateline, Paris 2052, an impressive landscape of horror. And here's the synopsis. This was to have been the happiest day of young Blanche Rouget's life. In Paris, the now electronic city of love, Blanche had been about to make her debut as a star. Then abruptly, the Black Emperor of South America had told the world of the missiles already racing northward. Panic had broken forth. And then came the real horror. A vast cloak of darkness had descended over the earth, and Blanche was hurled into a world gone mad in its death throes. So it's a story about World War that's initiated by weapons of mass destruction used by this emperor in South America. That's really just the premise for an exploration of social collapse and human ingenuity faced with this catastrophic situation. Towards the beginning of the text, you get this snapshot of the world that is destroyed by the war. And this has extended attention to quite interesting imaginings of cultured meat. And as in many of these texts, you get a sense of horror of the previous world, the old-fashioned bloody world of raising animals and killing them for food. Stock raising, that horror, had disappeared. Raising and caring for animals merely to hand them over to the butcher's knife, that was a custom worthy of the barbarians of the 20th century. There was no more livestock. Meats were grown under the direction of chemical engineers, following the ingenious pioneer Carrel, whose immortal chicken's heart still lived in the museum of the SPCA. The product so made was a perfect meat, tender without tendon, skin or fat, and of a great variety of flavors. So you get interestingly, quite an extended anticipation of the gastronomic possibilities of cultured meat. For a fine taste, a famous house fabricated meats with the taste of fruit or preserves, scented with flowers. The Christian Abstinence Society, whose slogan was "Eat to live, don't live to eat," had its own factory. Here, in order to help its members escape the sin of gluttony, it supplied them with meat with no taste at all. So meat is an infinitely ideologically malleable substance in its cultured variety that enables you to experience or deny yourself pleasure as suits you. And you get this pub, kind of a gastro pub, we would say, that has this spectacle of cultured meat. Beer Hall 13 was only a branch of the famous steak and fries factory, which was enormously successful. There was not a meat store in Paris which did not sell its blue plate special. The cellar of the beer hall contained the immense vat of serum in which floated the mother, a lump of meat weighing nearly 500 tons. An automatic device kept it trimmed into the shape of a cube, and cut a gigantic slice from each face every hour. It kept growing back indefinitely. A balcony surrounded the vat, and on Sunday the esteemed consuming public cast a melting glance at the mother, then went back upstairs to the beer hall to sample a bit. So here, cultured meat is not just food, it's also spectacle, and we'll come across the idea that it's a gendered project as well later in this presentation. Meat here, as with Two Planets, is framed as redemption, as the escapees from the Paris apocalypse arrive in the countryside. They know they've found a safe haven through the experience of meat. Chickens, rabbits, ducks, geese, turkeys, lambs had all fallen under the knives of cooks. Meat was grilling over the wood fires, stewing in earthenware kettles, juices trickling. The smells drifted out into the streets, swirling over the rooftops. So this is only one of many examples of a nostalgic impetus in the writing about cultured meat. The hypermodern product of in vitro flesh demands a turning back to the past and a relish in antiquated modes of meat production. We shall see this again shortly. Moving on to my favourite cultured meat text, which is 1952, Pole and Kornbluth, The Space Merchants. It was published the year before in a sci-fi periodical, I think it was the Astounding magazine, as The Gravy Planet. So it's the first of a number of collaborations between Pole and Kornbluth, and these were two leading lights of the Futurians, a left-leaning group of science fiction enthusiasts working in New York City in the 1930s and 1940s. Isaac Asimov, who many of you will know, was part of that circle as well. The Space Merchants provides a stinging critique of post-war programs of agricultural intensification that emerged in response to anxieties about the Earth's ability to sustain its growing population. So one of the key reference points for Pole and Kornbluth's novel is this interesting 1948 public information film, The Chicken of Tomorrow, that documented the race in America to develop a superior meat type chicken. So these innovations in food technology happening in the social milieu that Pole and Kornbluth were involved in is very much part of that motivation they're imagining of a future world. So this is the world that Pole and Kornbluth depict in The Space Merchants. Some of this is eerily prescient. So consumerism has become a religion. Addiction to consumer products is universal. Life is structured around debt. Does any of this sound familiar? And this produces a state something like slavery in its workers. Our hero is Mitch, who is a copywriter for an advertising company, who is kidnapped, and he's forced to work as a scum skimmer on a chlorella proteins plantation, harvesting algae from a series of tanks in a towering 80-story structure. And these proteins, this algae that he's involved in working with, is used to feed as a nutrient for the development of cultured meat. He becomes involved, initially half-heartedly, later more sincerely, with the World Conservationist Association, or CONSES as they are known. And he joins a widely demonized organization committing to fighting the reckless exploitation of natural resources and needless poverty and human misery it has created. So the CONSES are an environmentalist movement. And there's a reference there, I think, to the commies, so 1950s America's object of paranoia as well. So there's an interesting blending of environmental and left politics in the novel.
Mm.
And this is an illustration here from the serial version of the novel, The Gravy Planet. This is what cultured meat looks like in the 1950s imagination. And this is Chicken Little. So Chicken Little is this massive piece of rubbery flesh that starts as a piece of heart tissue, and it forms the basis of this huge industry that feeds everyone across the world. And there's dozens of pipes running into her pulsating flesh. There's lots of emphasis on the pulsating flesh, the texture and movement of the flesh. And interestingly, this is connected closely with the politics of the text, but also with the imagining of the ontology, the being of cultured meat. And you get this guy Herrera, who's a slicer, whose job it is to trim bits off Chicken Little in order to have it packaged up and sold around the world. And again, you can see in this quotation on the screen the gendering of cultured meat. So Herrera worked his way up to master slicer. He worked in the great cool vault underground where Chicken Little grew and was cropped by him and other artisans. He swung a sort of two-handed sword that carved off great slabs of the tissue, leaving it to the lesser packers and trimmers and their faceless helpers to weight it, shape it, freeze it, cook it, flavour it, package it, and ship it off to the area on quota for the day. He had more than a production group. He was a production job. He was a safety valve. Chicken Little grew and grew as she'd been growing for decades. Since she had started as a lump of heart tissue, she didn't know any better than to grow up against a foreign body and surround it. She didn't know any better than to grow and fill the concrete vault and keep growing, compressing her cells and rupturing them. As long as she got nutrient, she grew. Herrera saw to it that she grew round and plump, that no tissue got old and tough before it was sliced. So Herrera develops this weirdly sexualized relationship with Chicken Little in the novel, but it's also haunted by the gross, abject flesh that he's concerned with, and the novel is at pains to emphasize that it's really kind of gross stuff. And again, you get this theme of agricultural nostalgia running through the text. So the social bifurcation, the rich and the poor in the text, corresponds with people who eat new protein, that's food that's made from an animal, and regenerated protein, which is heavily processed, intensely marketed forms of cultured meat. So Mitch, he sees himself as a bit of a gastronome, and he can't stand anything but new protein. He hates the taste of cultured meat, regenerated protein merchandise. So cultured meat in the Space Merchants is very much a secondary product that serves to evoke the supposed satisfactions of the authentic original product. And it's also the site of political activism, in that environmentalism emerges weirdly from within the body of Chicken Little herself. In one of the novel's most extraordinary flights of fancy, Chicken Little is discovered to be more than she first appears. After Mitch joins the Conces, he's taken to a secret office concealed within her pulsating body and accessed by means of a whistle, which produces inaudibly high-frequency sound waves, able to goad that insensate bulk into moving aside. Chicken Little is the heart of the novel's portrayal of anti-capitalist resistance. It's from within her abject body that the revolution emerges. The Conce's ideology is based on the idea that nature's way of living was the right way of living. So again, ideas of nature are utilized as a form of critique against cultured meat. Moving
John,
on.
sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt, just to say if you could wrap it up in shortly, just so we have a little bit of time for discussion. I know you'll have to teach in about 15 minutes.
Yep. Okay, that's fine. So
Thank
I
you.
will zip through this. So Arthur
Yeah,
C. Clarke,
thanks.
headline news here is it's one of a number of texts that's about cannibalism. So the text is in the form of a lecture from a food executive, and they're baffled by the idea of carnism, and even more baffled when he tells them that this cultured meat project, Ambrosia Plus, has been cultured using human flesh. Best known one is Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake, and this is a text which advertises itself as referring only to things that already existed in the world in 2003 when Atwood was writing, another post-apocalyptic fiction. And you've got all kinds of weird biotechnological creatures here. You've got pigoons, which are used for growing organs. You've got a glow-in-the-dark bunny, which is based on Eduardo Katz, the Brazilian conceptual artist's Alba, Bunny GFP. And you've got the chicky knobs, who are these weird creatures with just a mouth, no head or beak, no eyes. And you've got this scene in which the God's gardeners, who are a version of the Conces and Poland Corn Blues text, try to liberate them, which raises that question, what does it mean to liberate a piece of cultured meat? Really quickly, you've got Beef, more recently, set in Australia, which is a vat meat executive who falls in love with a sensual musician and psychic Jean. She's employed to do the ad campaign for their vat meat. And she writes this song, a very sexualized song that's got the chorus, "My man's meat makes me know I'm a woman, want to put it in my mouth. Apologies for the crudity. I didn't write that. That's Matt Blackwell." But the punchline to this story is that when they come to slice off a bit of the vat meat as part of the advertising campaign, they realize that it's sentient. Actually, it's alive. "Stop, you're hurting it. It's alive," Jean screams, because she's psychic and she knows it can feel. So some of the stuff it means, it's usually the stuff of a sign of a world gone wrong. It suspends conventional ethical categories. Vegans can eat meat, humans can eat humans. It raises questions about ontology. What is it? Can we make friends with it? It raises wider issues about the future of human-animal relations. What other creatures will exist in a world fed by it? What landscape, politics, and economics does a cultured meat planet involve? And you've got here this series of oppositions that I think generally holds throughout the history of cultured meat: nature, technology, nature, future, past, corporation, community, post-human, human. So last slide. Why am I doing this? There's no way in which this can be straightforwardly instrumentalized or commodified. This doesn't provide a script for the development of cultured meat. It doesn't tell us straightforwardly whether cultured meat is a good idea or not. It might provide some kind of a cautionary tale, or indeed inspiration for new adventures in cellular agriculture. It tells us something about the complexity and inconsistency of the cultural attitudes that cultured meat embodies, the kinds of questions it raises, and reveals its situatedness in debates around landscape, nation, labour, identity, and human-animal relations. Food and cultured meat is never just a substance, but the performance of a fluctuating set of political, emotional, and social experiences, which are often deeply understood through analysis of narrative, whether formally through these literary texts or informally by the stories we might more casually tell about cultured meat. Those are just a few things I've published about cultured meat, so that is enough for me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. That was excellent. Very interesting. A lot of stories I had never heard of before. So, do we have any questions from our audience or participants or observations, comments?
I can ask if no one else.
Yeah, sure, Kat. I'll follow you.
I was just wondering, the first story that you talked about, was the author critical of the sort of eugenic aspect, or was she celebrating it?
She fails to be sufficiently critical of it. So there's the main character, Vera, registers a certain amount of shock at the realization that there's been this kind of process of genocide in the past, but she moves on from it quite quickly. She's not that bothered, and that the text never really holds on to any sustained political critique about it. So it registers a brief discomfort before moving on again to the benefits of the society. So, I mean, it's very difficult to kind of rescue Mary Bradley Lane from the idea that she was kind of a bit of a fascist, really.
Yeah. And just a quick follow-up there, because it seems like there was an assumption in that book, and I think often, that with improved tech and access to abundant food, suddenly we have an egalitarian, prosperous society. Is that something that kind of you've seen traveling through, or which ones are good at criticizing that assumption?
Yeah, I mean, so there are distinct phases. So you would tend to get in the 1880s and 1890s a kind of sense of the utopian possibility where social justice and food technology fit quite neatly together. By the time you get into the 1950s, it's gone almost entirely the other way, that depictions of cultured meat or advanced experiments in food technology are usually signifiers of a dystopian realm in which they materialize, as it were, the world gone wrong, where people live in miserable conditions, that there's no countryside anymore. But now I think that there's a little bit more ambivalence in kind of more recent writing about it. But I think what's interesting for me is you can see it kind of the representation of cultured mood is like a barometer for the mood of people's thinking about kind of social justice and food technology.
Thanks.
Interesting. I think Arve was next, and then Vilde, and then me.
Yeah, thank you. That was really fascinating. I'm curious, and I don't know if you follow like contemporary stuff on the same topic, but I was just really curious. Where is the science fiction now? Now that cultivated meat is a reality. So what direction is it or what direction is fiction taking it now? I just saw that cultivated quail is now available in Hong Kong, for example.
Oh, okay. The thing is, I find it quite hard to keep up. So I kind of prefer to work in the Victorian period because the Victorians aren't writing any more novels, which makes them very easy to work with. And particularly, there's so much just popular press around cultured meat at the moment. There are some strands I can talk about. And what one trope in more recent literature is the idea of cultured meat forgery. So you have the idea that cultured meat is intellectual property. So you have these large corporations that own the rights, kind of like Monsanto, that owns the intellectual property of rice or something. I don't know. So if you want to have cultured meat, you have to buy the company's version. And so there's like a couple of stories about like kind of like backstreet cultured meat forgery operations, and as a basis for kind of an intrigue of the corporation against the individual. That's one trend. One of the things that's super interesting for me is you still get this emphasis on sexual politics. So thinking about Carol Adams' like key work, The Sexual Politics of Meat, I'm sure many of you will know. The sexual politics of cultured meat is really fascinating. About you've got a transferal of all of those kind of patriarchal ideas about flesh is reenacted in cultured meat. So the idea that cultured meat somehow kind of provides an escape from conventional carnist ideas isn't held up. I think Mac Blackwell's novel, even though a lot of it is quite gross and quite sexist, is a really interesting example of that kind of obsessive sexualization of flesh, even in the context of food technology. And I'm sure, I mean, I'm not really kept up to date that much with the film side of things. There's certainly a whole thing about cultivating celebrity flesh. So choose your favorite celebrity, steal a bit of their DNA and turn them into a burger. So that's what one strand in it as well. And there have been various articles about that. Have a Taylor Swift burger or something. And again, that's often like really sexualized too, and about celebrity culture and ideas of consumption, how we kind of consume celebrities, literally in the sense of cultured meat, but I guess in other ways, through digital media, for example.
Very interesting. Yeah, Vilde?
Yeah, it's maybe more of a comment, or just if you have made some thoughts regarding it. But I see that through the different books that you kind of talked about, there is this almost ethical or justification of the world being better with killing off animals instead of domesticating them and then slaughtering them. So I was just wondering if you made some thoughts about that.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that emerges in the project is that carnism and neo-carnism, if that's what you want to call cultured meat, are inextricable. So they're like two sides of the same coin. So the more you produce cultured meat, the more you become attached to traditional meat. So that sense of tradition and innovation are really like inseparable. So the sense that cultured meat might be a kind of vegan liberationist project, for example, is definitely not held up by the literary history, which contains this really notable strand of nostalgia. If only we could go back to killing things, everything would be okay. And that for me is like super interesting about like, holding on to veganism as a dissident discourse that can't easily be conscripted into like corporate ideologies. The rise of plant-based capitalism, for example, as my colleague Eva Giraud describes it. So I think that's like a really super interesting idea about the kind of shifts in food politics and how vegetarianism always remains, kind of haunts the margins of these debates in these texts.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I was also, well, I was wondering a little bit about the sexual politics of meat, but like you kind of mentioned that. But going into this last point, I think that's quite interesting, this image of the cultured meat reality as lacking nature in a way, or like as kind of identified with the unnatural, right? And the lack of animals or these natural landscapes, and yet at the same time somehow also utopian, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's interesting because actually, well, within a kind of vegan imaginary, this would be a tool for liberating animals from agriculture. So it's
Mm-hmm.
very fascinating that you don't actually see that in historical literature. But yeah, it's just a comment. And it's kind of disappointing in a way that yeah.
I mean, it's super interesting because one of the things that is really striking is the relationship to cultured meat and discourses of landscape aesthetics. What would the countryside look like if there's no cows anymore? And that is often framed as a sense of loss or nostalgia. So one of the things I look at in these texts is the representation of landscape. What does the countryside, if any of it exists, look like? And that raises the question also, what would a vegan landscape aesthetics be like? Because our sense of landscape in the UK, where I am, is really inextricable from the long history of animal agriculture. You think about kind of the iconic images of the UK, that often you would see like a cow in the foreground or sheep grazing on the hills of the Lake District. Think about Wordsworth's poetry of the Lake District, for example, synonymous with a British sense of national identity. But what would it be like to kind of rewrite that or think about that from a vegan perspective? What is the vegan countryside? What kind of changes might that herald? And I don't sense really in vegan studies that there is a really developed sense of landscape aesthetics, which is kind of interesting because that's one of the things that kind of carnists often throw back at the vegans. What's the countryside going to look like? What's going to happen to all of the animals? And you get a bit of that in the Matt Blackwell novel, where cows, because nobody eats them, evolve into these terrifying beasts that kill people, so that they become like these apex predators and they live underground, these burrowing creatures. So that's like a really interesting depiction of the future of livestock in a post meat society.
Wow. Yeah, very interesting. I'm kind of personally disappointed because I would like a kind of happier future for cultured meat, but very fascinating. Do we have any more questions for John? Okay, so then just wanted to thank you again for this really fascinating presentation, and very much looking forward to the outcome of your research. Yeah, so just another round of applause for you, virtual applause, and I'll see you, or not virtual, auditory applause, and we'll see you all back in 5 minutes.
Thanks so much. Thanks for all your questions. And if anybody wants to drop me an email to chat about any of this stuff, I'd be really happy to hear from you.
Okay, well, thank you.
See you later.
See you later.